Excited to be here and to get to know all of you better. Joining me in this fireside chat will be Alex Alben. Hi, Alex.
Hi,
Alex.
Stephanie.
Alex has worked as a technology professional, an expert, I should say, for over 20 years. He's an expert in all things privacy. He actually served as Washington State's Chief Privacy Officer from 2015 to 2019. You worked on consumer privacy legislation, coordinated privacy data policies, state and local governments. Alex is also a Stanford University graduate and a Stanford Law School graduate. He currently teaches privacy law at UCLA. And Alex, I'm surprised you and I have never met because, I've done a lot of privacy stories in LA. So I'm definitely putting you on my list of experts to call for the next time
I
we do
will.
a story.
I will return your phone calls.
Thank you. So, obviously, this is such a timely topic, especially after the election that we just had. And so, I'm going to toss it over to you, Alex. I know you have a little presentation that you're going to give. And then after that, I have a list of, formal questions, but we're going to keep this kind of loose, fun, informal. We're hoping to have a lively discussion. And I definitely want you guys to chime in with any questions that you have. So, Alex, we'll pass it over to you.
Thanks. Thanks so much for that kind introduction. And I do want to emphasize, Stephanie, what you just said to the group is that please, send questions in, and we don't want you to leave this fireside chat with a question that you didn't have answered. But we're going to try to cover a lot of ground. And speech on the internet is on everyone's mind. It's been controversial, to say the least, particularly in the last two election cycles. But one of the things that I like to do as a teacher is take a little step back to understand how we got to where we are. I think the current landscape with social media and the press and private actors and politicians is very confusing to many people, and confusing for good reason. They're not clear how we got to where we are. They're not clear what laws might apply to speech or to banning people for their speech. And so I thought it really might be worthwhile just to do a little bit of a roadmap of where we are. So I'm going to go into my desktop and my PowerPoint for today. And let's see. And now you see my Zoom screen. Okay, so here we go. Slideshow. And there's a fireside. No one's chatting there, but it's a fireside. So what does free speech mean online? I think this is a really interesting question. Speech changes a lot depending on how you're speaking, what platform is being used to convey that speech. I think that makes intuitive sense to most of us. But if you look at how speech evolved in the modern era, at least, let's say from the year 1890 onward, speech is dominated by technology. In the old days, speech was a person getting in front of an audience, a group, and with his or her voice reaching that audience. Telephony changed all of that in a very significant way when it enabled a speaker to speak across the country and across the world. And Americans and others, fell in love with the telephone. It was very rapidly adopted, and the industry evolved around telephony. Those of you who might have been born in my era would remember something called the Bell system. It was American Telephone and Telegraph, AT&T, which was the monopoly for telephony. This is sort of an interesting concept because many people today are saying that social media platforms such as Facebook are monopolies. The Bell system was a true monopoly. If you wanted to be able to make a phone call or buy a telephone, you had to buy it from Ma Bell. And the nature of that platform, of course, in the United States at least, was one-to-one communication. If I wanted to communicate with somebody, I dialed their number. Later on, we had things like conference calls, but the basic technology was I had to identify a very few set of people in my audience, and then I could reach out to them. In fact, the slogan for AT&T for a while was "Reach out and touch someone," and that was a very popular technology. But in the 1990s, the U.S. government decided that AT&T had grown too big and that it was stifling innovation. And as a result of that, the government broke up the Bell system. They broke it up into 6 smaller companies, which are called baby bells. One of them was Pacific Bell. And these companies actually did a lot of innovation. They revolutionized long distance. They did video calling and other technologies that they brought online. One might say that this was successful in breaking up this monopoly. These monopolies, though, the Bell system was called a common carrier. And that concept means that you, the company, has to serve everybody. It has to take all comers and give them basic service. And that's a very important part of the regulated monopoly model. So the things to take away from this little history lesson are, we have had a monopoly before over at least electronic speech. We decided as a country to break it up. And that model was known as the common carrier model. Now, radio and television are different forms of mass communication, starting with radio in the United States in the 1920s, more or less, and television, which came in the late 1940s, early 1950s. We shifted to a communication model which is one to many. If you own a radio station or a TV station, you can communicate to everybody within the signal range of your station. And then even later repeating that across the country. But initially, the UHF and the VHF channels reached a defined audience. So if you see Stephanie on Fox 11, that has a big stick that's up on Mount Wilson, and that is the signal range of Fox 11, which is then later amplified by other systems. So the one-to-many model was amazingly successful. People rapidly adopted television and radio, and you actually needed to have quite an infrastructure in order to be a broadcaster. It's expensive. Not only do you need a TV station and a big stick or antenna, you need to have an audience that has television sets or radios. And similarly, in the olden days, before 1990, let's say, to be a publisher, you need to have a printing press, you need to have distribution and trucks and an infrastructure around that. The point to take away here is that there were barriers to entry. To be a speaker, you needed to have an investment in the technology, and that investment was substantial. In the case of a TV station today, it's tens of millions of dollars. And this is an important point because the internet very rapidly has upended this model of having high barriers in order to reach a big audience. The other thing you used to need in the broadcast communication day were people who were called journalists, professional journalists. I was lucky enough in my first job to work for Walter Cronkite at CBS News. And also there's a newsroom depicted here of the Washington Post in its heyday with their editor-in-chief, Ben Bradley, who broke the Watergate story, among other stories. These professional journalists were trained. They fact-checked their stories. They had a very strong code of ethics and a code of professional responsibility, and that defined the product. So when we did the CBS Evening News and sat down in the morning to say, what are we going to say tonight for 25 minutes to America, it was a very serious, deliberative process, and there were lots of filters. We brought in many, many different considerations about what we should be publishing that day based on what we knew about the audience. The internet flips this model on its head. You don't need a license for a TV station. You don't need to buy a big printing press. So the barriers to entry in the internet economy are incredibly low. Essentially today, you can have a broadcast or a podcast or a Facebook page for the cost of having a computer and an internet connection. And most of the software can be free. This means that anybody can be a publisher, and not just a publisher within this small area of what a radio station or a television station or a newspaper can cover. You can be a global publisher right away out of the gate. From Los Angeles, you can reach people in China and Africa and South America. It's an amazing technology when you think about it. And that's one of the reasons why over the last 25 years or so, the internet has become the dominant communications platform around the world. Now, remember I said that telephones were a one-to-one basic communication. And that's also true of the internet, right? We can use the internet one-to-one. I can send somebody an email, or I can do a Zoom chat with one other friend, or I can do Facebook that's directed maybe a message or an iMessage to one friend. So the internet is one-to-one, replacing telephony, but it's also one-to-many. One individual can reach thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people. And as you know, the most popular people on Twitter have upwards of 2 to 3 million followers. The other thing I'd like you to think about is that this technology is very new in the scheme of things. I mean, those of you who were born in 1994, you were born just at the cusp of what we would call the commercial internet era. But that was only 26 years ago. When Yahoo was founded, I worked for a company called Real Networks, which started audio and video on the internet, started streaming media. Google was not founded until 1998 in a dorm room by Larry Page and Sergey Brin at Stanford. Facebook, which now is thought of as this huge monopoly, the most powerful company, was only founded in 2004 and did not take off in terms of hitting very big numbers until later, 2008 or 2010. Twitter and the iPhone came in around 2006. I believe Twitter was founded in March of 2006, and Apple introduced the first iPhone in 2007. These are very new technologies, and the problems that are associated today that we're experiencing are partially because they are new technologies, and also because the laws that we have evolved from this earlier era. Our laws go back to the era of telephones and broadcast radio and broadcast TV. Congress has written very few laws that deal with the internet era, which is why in many ways we have encountered a lot of issues over the last few years. And then there's the blogosphere. This is a model that a very sophisticated graphic artist has written. You know, how do you get people to write about you? Well, you need to have content and then you blog. It's that easy. And that means that anybody with an opinion can be a publisher. You don't have to go to journalism school. You don't have to do years of earning your dues at a small paper and a small radio station and work your way up and understand that there's a code of ethics. The internet rewards people with opinion, and it rewards people with very sharp opinions, very controversial opinions. The more opinionated you are, the more likely you are to build an audience on the internet. The other thing, just to throw a few statistics at you, is that the platforms became popular in a way that no one ever imagined. I remember when I worked for ESPN, the company that started ESPN.com in 1994 495, we had a day when we had 1 million users. And we just couldn't imagine having 1 million users visit our website in a day. That number was just so big. We had a party, we got potato chips and soda or whatever. But we were celebrating 1 million. Today, Facebook has 2.4, actually it's closer now to 2.6 billion monthly active users. And also a lot of daily users, 300 million people a day across the world are using Facebook and Twitter, Google, and these big platforms. They are hugely, hugely popular around the world in a way that nobody ever envisioned. If you are an Instagram user, you're most likely a young adult, you're most likely under 35, and they have over 1 billion users. Now, Instagram also, as you know, is owned by Facebook. Facebook also owns WhatsApp. Facebook started out as I want to talk to my friends. I posted some photos when a friend of mine would have a deer, walking around her front lawn eating her roses. That was something that she would send out on Facebook, and that is a wonderful use of Facebook. When we complain today about Facebook, we're not complaining about people who are posting photos of their dog or their cat or a deer that's running around their front yard. And Facebook is also used, for many, many beneficial, reasons where people can communicate valuable news. Just in the middle slide, one of my Facebook friends who's a volunteer at Swedish Hospital is posting about their use of the vaccine. I mean, these are things that are wonderful. They build community. They build a sense of people connecting with each other in the way that I think Facebook was intended, initially to do. But Facebook has also become a forum, as you know, to groups and groups that have politicized the debate and the dialogue on Facebook. And that is what has given rise to a lot of the controversy that we've experienced in the last few years. Facebook enables groups, and groups can publish political opinions. And Facebook ran into issues because the so-called open platform that Facebook had was very rapidly manipulated by actors, both foreign actors and domestic actors, who fed it with misinformation. And it's the misinformation and the climate that has occurred where Facebook, cannot possibly vet the 300 million users that are using it every day. They have to use tools, they have to use robots, they have to use computer programs, and their effort to rein in the speech of this mass audience has given rise to the issues we have today. So if you say, how could we have allowed this to happen? You might think, well, nobody thought that this mass medium of billions of users would spring up in literally a few years. Television, interestingly, is still the way that most people get news. So this is good for Stephanie, especially local news. But online media is rapidly approaching parity with television in terms of how people get their news, according to the Pew Foundation. So just to wrap up, we are, and we'll deal with a lot of these points in our Q&A, but we have speech on privately owned platforms. Twitter and Facebook are not owned by the government. They are owned by their stockholders. They're private. They have adopted speech codes in an effort to control and limit, to some extent, what is said on their platforms. There's a very big problem with how to regulate speech that is violent or offensive. And the question that I think we're left with these days is who decides what should be on these platforms and not. And there were decisions that were made in this last election. So Facebook and Twitter both took the unprecedented step of banning President Trump's accounts, both from Facebook and from Twitter during the election. not because they don't like President Trump, ex-President Trump, but because he violated the standards of speech that they had announced were necessary in order to be part of the community. And then we can also talk about this section under the Communications Decency Act that protects Facebook, Google, Amazon, and others from being sued. So I'm looking forward to having this discussion about who has the right to speak online, what can we do in a global community, and are there companies that get so big that once again they may need to be regulated as a monopoly.
All right. Thank
All
you,
right.
Alex.
Thank you.
Great information and great background there.
Okay.
The thing that stood out to me in that last graph, that last page, was who decides. I mean, I think that's sort of at the crux of this chat here. It's hard not to talk about this topic without talking about politics, because it's so interwoven, and President Trump did bring a lot of these issues to the forefront, as you mentioned. Okay, so when Jack Dorsey took that unprecedented step to ban President Trump from Twitter, politics aside, whether you're on the left, whether you're on the right, I think there were some people who were uncomfortable with that initially. Even people on the left, no matter what your political views were. I know that other journalists had very long discussions about it. At first glance, and maybe you'll agree with me on this, did that make a lot of people uncomfortable in terms of violating free speech? First of all, talk about that, and then kind of lay out for us in a little more detail why you think that was the right move, and explain it from a legal perspective.
Well, what we mean by free speech is that it's speech protected by the Constitution of the United States. And the First Amendment, as you know, says, Congress shall make no law that abridges speech and the right to assembly. Facebook and Twitter are private companies. And just as within the building of a private company, the government isn't making laws about what you can say, Facebook is not a free speech actor. You are coming into their building or their network, and when you do, you sign this little terms of service, which everybody does when they create a Facebook account, that says, we will abide by the rules of Facebook. You're automatically out of the realm of speech. So when Facebook takes away, or Twitter bans the president's account, they are not exercising First Amendment rights. They are exercising their private rights to regulate what people say within their private network. Now, you can say, wow, can you have a private network that has 2 billion people on it? That just seems so huge. It's the whole world.
Right.
But in fact, the point I was trying to make in the presentation is, yes, you can have a private network governed by private speech. So, President Trump, when he was president, actually made this point that he was simply exercising his First Amendment rights. But legally, that's not quite correct. First, he's a government official, and government officials are subject to certain rules and can't actually say certain things without violating the law. He apparently didn't read that part of the Constitution. But further, the social media platforms were not limiting his free speech rights. They were limiting his private speech rights to be a speaker on a very big platform.
Can you also, and you guys, if anyone has any questions, feel free to throw them in the chat, and we'll just kind of bring you guys in too as we go along here. But as we continue, can you explain is it the Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, and what the president was using sort of as his defense? I know that, and correct me if I'm wrong, they were trying to get these companies, Facebook, Twitter, and the like, to be more responsible for what their users say. Can you explain that?
I will just admit my bias first, that I'm an internet company guy. So when we were building the internet back in the 1990s, not me personally, but the people in the companies that I worked with, we were very concerned that we were having millions of users come to our doorstep every day, and we couldn't control what people were saying, and we didn't want to control what people were saying.
Right.
If someone had an opinion about the LA Rams and thought it was, terrible that the LA Rams traded, their quarterback, they could say that on our platform. And if they said, "Oh, and we think that so and so is a bad person," we weren't regulating their speech. And it was really a task that was impossible. If we were going to have an open platform with chat rooms and this other technology, then we couldn't censor everybody. We didn't want to. And the tech companies went to Congress and said, we are not the publishers of this speech. We're a platform, but we are not controlling what is said. It's the users that are controlling what is said. It's user generated speech. We should not be subject to being sued if somebody posts something on our platform in a chat room or a bulletin board that offends somebody else. Let the other private party sue the person who, is the offender, the alleged offender, but you should protect us, the tech platforms. And Congress agreed with this approach. They said, you don't monitor the speech and you don't publish it. So we're not going to hold you liable for things like slander or other bad things that might be said on your network. And this is what Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act does. It basically creates a shield from being sued for speech offenses on the part of users. Now, when he was president and got into fights with the big tech companies such as Amazon and Twitter, President Trump thought, I really want to hurt the tech companies, and one way to hurt them is to take away this Section 230 shield that they have, because then they'll be sued and it will hurt them financially, and they'll stop being such big platforms, and maybe they won't publish speech that's against me. I don't know exactly what the thinking was, but the president passed an executive order, or signed an executive order that tried to take away some of the Section 230 protections. The effort was not successful. Section 230 still exists, but it became a very politicized issue in the last election. And there's one side of the debate that says, the tech companies really shouldn't have this shield anymore. And if we want them to act more responsibly, we want to take away the shield. There's other people, in which I fall into the second camp, that say, actually, if you took away the shield, the tech companies would simply shut down speech.
Right.
Anything that was controversial, they would say, oh, we don't even want to deal with this anymore because we don't want to be sued. I think there are some good arguments on both sides of this, but that's what Section 230 does.
Yeah, and it does seem like a bit of a slippery slope. I mean, describe the world had that effort been successful. And you kind of touched on it a little bit. I mean, would we all just have to be posting about, what we had for breakfast and rainbows every day? Like that
You
doesn't
could
seem like
post
a good
about
thing.
a deer coming into your front yard and your very cute
Which is
dog,
great. I love
right?
deer, but
Right, which some people might say, oh, well, that's what Facebook was intended to do. It was
right.
intended to be, just communication that was more personal in nature and not controversial. But once you allow users to publish, then you allow them to publish what they want to say, and this has given rise to the problem of the platform being manipulated by outside parties sometimes, or simply by being used by very offensive speakers whose speech Facebook and others have decided should not be amplified.
Right. And Jennifer posted in the chat, she was using an example of when the broadcasting companies were penalized for the Janet Jackson halftime incident. We all remember that. The FCC said that they had gone against those FCC regulations for broadcasting nudity, even though it was clearly accidental. They still, got fined or whatever. And then So her question is, how do these types of misused enforced regulations actually hurt free speech to create the more relaxed environment of similar regulations simply because the subject is someone like Trump? So, like, is there any way that you could see a more uniform way to interpret and enforce these regulations in order to not be so biased? And that, obviously politics plays a big role here, but
Well, television and radio stations have a big problem is that they have a broadcast license. Um, the spectrum that they use to do their broadcast is renewed every few years by the federal government. And as a condition of having that license, they have to follow certain rules and regulations that are determined by the Federal Communications Commission, or the FCC. That's why in this Super Bowl incident that occurs, the FCC can say, we don't think you're following the obligations of your license. That doesn't exist at all for social media. The internet is the Wild West. The internet is an unregulated medium. Or I would say more accurately, the internet is a self-regulated medium where companies like Twitter and Google and Amazon are saying, no, we need to have our own rules about what can be said on our platform.
okay, but let's talk a little bit about, the FCC's role. You talked about it for television stations, with the internet being the Wild West. Some would argue, should there be tighter controls? Is that the direction we're heading? Because when I look at the Ma Bell example, that was a monopoly as you laid it out. And I mean, one could argue that Facebook, Instagram, which is owned by Facebook, Twitter, I mean, that to me feels like a monopoly. So are we headed into more regulations? But then again, there's that slippery slope. We don't want to muzzle people. Like, how do you
Well,
balance
there
that?
are countries where the government does control the internet and what you can say on the internet. Um, I don't think we want to live in North Korea, where it's very clear what can be said and not said. I don't think we want to live in China or Iran or other countries where uh, when there is no concept of free speech. And actually, in a very tragic way, we're seeing this conflict today in Hong Kong, where a free society that had a relatively free and open press is now being muzzled by a society that believes in controlling the system, the Chinese government, the political party in China, the Communist Party, that now is exerting control over what can be said and not said. And if you say things that are not in accord with what the government wants, you can go to jail. All right, we don't want that scenario. The question is, how do we keep things sane on these platforms? And to take it out of strict politics for a second, COVID brought in this public health concern that we want to give people accurate information about the virus. If we say misleading things about the virus, like, oh, you can drink, toilet bowl disinfectant and it will get rid of the virus, we don't want that kind of view, populated, because people could get hurt. I mean,
Sure.
people can be deceived and hurt. So just on a public health basis, is it reasonable to say that certain kinds of messages should be banned? And if you cross or agree with that, then you are also likely to agree with a whole bunch of other things that should not happen on these platforms. When we started the first internet chat rooms in the 1990s, we had to deal with some pretty ugly speech. We were dealing with people who were harassing each other. We were dealing with people who were making death threats. And it came about very quickly in the first year when we started these platforms. And so we took those messages down. And I had to write a little speech code about these are things that you can't say on our sports network. And I think that there is a societal consensus that certain things, certain kinds of speech are offensive and they're out of bounds. I think the political speech is a much harder question. But then, even as you know, Stephanie, the public health debate has become politicized over the last year.
Yeah. But you did talk about, I keep going back to who decides. Is what's offensive one day, not offensive the next, and vice versa. I mean, it does seem like a slippery slope, and we're in cancel culture now. I mean, are we on a dangerous path here? Like, who decides? And if I get offended, does that make it offensive? It's such a gray area.
It's very hard to determine what's offensive. Um, in the law, we have a concept of community standards. The community will not accept this. So let's take one example, child pornography. We have decided in the United States and most other civilized countries, child pornography is out of bounds. We will not tolerate it. And therefore, if you try to publish it, we will take it down. It gets a lot harder when you get into other types of issues where there isn't community consensus. For example, I think that there are arguments about what the right course of action is on regulating the vaccine. So, that's a political decision, and it's hard for Facebook to make that decision. Maybe impossible. Facebook had to hire 10,000 people just to do content moderating over the last year, but they can't possibly decide all of these nuanced questions that come up. And then there's this other dimension to the problem, because Facebook and Twitter are global platforms. Which community are we talking about? Because different communities have different sensibilities, different cultures, different languages. What makes sense for a community in India is not necessarily going to be accepted in Pakistan. And in fact, Facebook has a very big problem now with hate speech that is circulating in India against Muslims and against people who live in Pakistan, because it's acceptable in one country. So if you say, oh, well, we'll apply India's community, well, that's offensive to people who live in this other community. This is a problem that we never faced before because we never had this huge global speech platform.
Yeah, and I don't know if any of you guys have seen The Social Dilemma. I mean, we could do a whole forum on that. That was kind of scary. I mean, I know you're an internet guy, but just what were your thoughts on that?
Well, these things are scary. I mean, we can get into the way Facebook and these other companies make money, right? One of the reasons why they grew so quickly is that they're free, essentially free platforms. But as it turns out, the thing that people were giving up was their personal data that then Facebook, as well as other tech companies, are able to monetize. And so they make a lot of money understanding who you are and what you buy, and when you buy it, down to what time of day you buy things. And these are very valuable pieces of data. Now, some people say Facebook controls so much data and they collect so much about you that, in a sense, they're like a police state. And yet, you're not being forced to be on Facebook. You voluntarily join this platform. And I think that the average person understands that they are giving up facts about themselves when they say, my name is Alex and I live in Los Angeles and I do this for a living and I have a dog, right? The more information you put out there, the more privacy you are giving up. And yet there are some practices that Facebook and others were following that were not really disclosed and that needed to be corrected, and that even today there has been news about the way targeted advertising is going to be changing on major internet platforms. This is a very hot topic.
Absolutely. I'd like to ask you guys joining us here, how many people saw The Social Dilemma? Raise your hands. What'd you guys think of it? And did anybody have any thoughts they want to share? I'd like to hear from the group a little bit about it. Did anybody change the way that they do things on the internet because of it?
Yeah, I could definitely chime in. I watched that documentary with my sister. I've actually worked in ed tech and in social media for quite a while. So it was interesting for me to see. I had learned about social media from the perspective of businesses and businesses who were using these algorithms and these advertisements to their benefit and really praising how effective they were. So it was really interesting to see the other perspective of like, okay, well, these might be hyper effective advertisements, but really, what is it doing to the consumer on a grand scale when every individual is targeting them?
Yeah. And I thought that, the fact also too that you are being fed information based on your algorithms. And so it's almost like, and Alex, you can weigh in on this, Facebook creating these tiny little microcosms, micro bubbles of information, which a lot of people, let's talk politics for a minute. A lot of people say really contributed to and is continuing to contribute to our divided country. Alex?
Well, not to defend all of Facebook's practices, but to
We're putting you on
explain,
the hot seat here.
but to explain why this technology works the way it does. It works this way because people have affinities, right? They have likes and dislikes. Um, I like news about a certain baseball team. Facebook is going to feed me news about that baseball team, till I'm oversaturated. And everybody of my friends that is talking about this baseball team, I'm going to get their feed prioritized. And the algorithms that Facebook uses are crawling Facebook to give me the information based on my previous usage patterns I have indicated that I like. Now, this does have this filter bubble effect of accelerating and emphasizing content that you have seen in the past and that you gravitate towards. And this has been criticized as being socially irresponsible. There was a really interesting book called Zucked by Roger McNamee that was written about this phenomenon, and I encourage you to read it. But then the question is, well, what should Facebook give you? Should it give you information you are not interested in? Should it emphasize the friends who you never click on and you never repost? Um, and I think that the best answer that I've heard, is that Facebook should give you more control over your newsfeed, over what you want, and so that users can say, "I don't want politics today," or "I don't want to hear about this topic. I want to hear more about that topic." Facebook is now automating all of this for you. But I think that there could be tools that allow users to have information that is just not bombarding them with their past practices. This isn't going to be easy to do, but there are solutions, and it starts with the transparency of how Facebook works today.
Since we're talking politics, let's talk about Parlor for a minute because I think this brings in, let's just throw it all out there. I think this brings out in an interesting point about the providers, if you will, the App Store. Apple, Google, we're not just talking about the apps themselves, but they took the step to remove Parlor from their actual platform, which again takes it one step further beyond just the apps like Facebook and Instagram. What are your thoughts on that and their responsibility?
This is fascinating, and we've never encountered it before. Um, when Amazon and other companies essentially said, "We're not going to host Parlor, we're not going to give you tools, we're not going to allow your application to be downloaded from the Apple Store," it was one tech company against another tech company. And what Amazon said, and Amazon has been sued by Parlor, is, "We read your terms of service, Parlor, and we don't think you're following your own terms of service with respect to the kind of speech that you're allowing. So we're just going to take down your application." Now, I don't know if this is a good metaphor or not. It's like saying, I'm a paint company and I painted somebody's house, but then I don't like the music they're playing in this house. So I'm just going to shut your house down because I was involved in painting it. You know, Amazon is not running Parlor. Amazon is not controlling the speech that was on Parlor. Amazon is saying, oh, we're providing a service to you, Parlor. So I don't know if that metaphor worked at all, but it's very unusual for a technology company to retaliate against another company and then say, oh, you didn't follow your own rules. So we're in very uncharted territory here.
Yeah, I think we have been since 2016. We've had a lot of uncharted territory things, which, in some way is,
Yeah.
probably.
But I want to make a point about 2016. In 2016, the problem that was identified was that basically the Russians, although also North Korea and Iran to some extent, were opening up fake accounts on Facebook and taking out fake ads on Facebook. And Facebook was not doing a very good job detecting who was the real origin of these ads or these websites. And as you know, these websites spread hate speech, they spread misinformation, they posed as other groups. So, for example, they posed as Black Lives Matter groups and fed disinformation that was very offensive through those sites. And Facebook created or amplified this problem by not policing its platform. So when 2020 came around, Facebook created a very robust set of security protocols to shut down fake sites and to shut down fake ads. I have to say, I haven't done an exhaustive study of this, but from what I've read, Facebook was largely successful in 2020 in shutting out Russian interference. However, the Russians moved on, right? The Russians then started attacking other parts of our infrastructure, and Facebook did not adequately think about the domestic manipulation of its own platform by groups inside the United States, and even groups who in fact are who they say they are, were publishing disinformation. So the issues around speech and manipulation shifted from foreign interference in 2016 to what I would call domestic interference in 2020. And in a way, that's a much harder problem to solve.
Yeah, and Suzanne was nodding her head. Suzanne, did you have a comment? I'd like to hear what you think about this. There she is. There you are.
Am I audible?
Yes, we can hear you.
It's interesting because I have in-laws who are living in France, and during the 2020 election cycle, and they have their own election coming up next year, which is going to be another interesting situation. But I feel like it's interesting the information that they were receiving about our election was not necessarily the same thing that we were seeing on our side for our election. So I thought that was also curious. I don't know if it was orchestrated. I have no way to know that, but it was very interesting that my in-laws in France had a very different perspective based on what they were seeing on social media, as opposed to like what was, actually, I suppose, occurring in the US. And I'm not sure who regulates that.
Like, was there, without getting too deep into it, like, can you give us an example just so we can kind of understand to what degree?
Oh, sure. No, it was, I'm not sure if I can point to a specific one. It was kind of like a general trend. I'm not quite sure. And France is not necessarily known. They've had their own, media regulation situations in the past few years as well. But just that it seemed like they were getting different information than, I suppose, and I feel like I listen to the radio, I read the news, I have multiple sources of information, and so I felt like I kind of knew what was going on, but that they did not see the same things that I was seeing in the US.
Like maybe more pro-Trump or more pro-Biden, or not necessarily, just more detailed?
It sounded like they were receiving a lot of the pro-Trump, like, oh gosh, you guys are really, really in danger. Like he's going to be the next president. Like, and we're like, yeah, really, that's not quite what we're seeing over here, because a lot of people on the ground and people I don't know. It was interesting that that was more visible to them. They were fairly certain that he was definitely going to be the next president, and I was, you know, and the voice in France right now, there's someone who is very likely going to make it into the second round of elections in France, who I've been kind of describing as Trump in a skirt, if you want to go that route. But and she's getting a lot of airtime, so that might have also affected it. So maybe they're seeing more of that because of their media also amplifying that kind of side of things.
That's interesting. Alex, what can you say about that, the amplification overseas versus domestic?
Well, it's a good point. I think there's a meta point about who has a monopoly on the truth. We base our notion of what is true based on a lot of different inputs in our media. And I'm not surprised that the perspective in France or other countries was not the same as what we were getting in the United States, not simply based on social media, but also just based on media. France has a more regulated media than the United States. And there are countries, even like the BBC in England, that have a much more official, vetted kind of news standard that gives people a different perspective on events. But every Western country, every country with an internet infrastructure is going to be subject to manipulation. The Russians have pursued manipulation in other countries, particularly in the Ukraine, before they invaded the Ukraine, and we can expect that there will be misinformation coming in every country in the world in every election. And this is a problem with the structure of the internet in that it's very hard to catch the bad guys. It's very hard to put them in jail, or even to find them, or even to put them on trial. And there are scholars and leaders and tech companies who have tried to work out some solutions here, but it's far off in the future.
So I guess going forward, what can we do, better? How can we do better going forward but still keep that balance between free speech, privacy, rights of privacy, making sure the information is accurate? I mean, give us the perfect scenario, if there is one.
Let's start with privacy, which is not the easy one. Privacy is a two-way street. Yes, we need to have more regulation against companies, not just technology companies, but any company that is taking your personal information. When you go to the supermarket, that company is taking information about everything you're buying, and they're building a profile of you. They're not a big tech company. So consumers are being tracked wherever they go. The focus has been on tech companies because the tools that are used by tech companies are more sophisticated, and we use them a lot for shopping. So we are giving them lots of data. I think the principle that we want to adhere to is of consent. If I give you my data, I'm giving it to you for a reason. I want to buy a product. I want to read a book or do some service. And the data should only be used for that purpose. I think that is a principle that has been adopted in Europe through their new privacy law. And it's a principle that we need to bring to the United States. We started to do that with a law in California that was passed 2 years ago called the CCPA. People in California do have some privacy rights to know what companies have about them, and actually to ask companies not to sell their data. We can do more to create better laws around privacy, and I work in this area. But you guys also have a part to do in terms of being much more conscious about the information you are putting out about yourself. People put out their location data when they don't need to. If you have a phone and if you have a bunch of apps running, you might have location data turned on, but you don't need to have location data for your flashlight or some other apps that are on your phone. You can control to some extent, your information footprint, and we need to be better educated about that. In terms of our behavior on social media, younger people tend to be a little bit more sophisticated about what they're putting out there about themselves, and a little more conscious. But everybody needs to be aware that what you put out there is forever. When you
Yeah.
make a post on Facebook, it can be captured, and even if you delete it, it's out there. So we need to be very careful about what we say and what we do, unless we intend it to be a permanent record of our behavior and leave a trail that's permanent. We do need some laws that are more effective in dealing with the use of information that people put out there about themselves. And maybe we need something that they do have in Europe called a right to be forgotten. If you have something in your past that is out of date, it might be something that's embarrassing about you. In Europe, you have a right to request from Google and the other search engines that they delete the search results about whatever incident that you want to delete.
That's great. We can do that, Alex, in this country, but it takes thousands in legal fees, correct?
Well, we also have a First Amendment that says that publishers, newspapers, television stations, Facebook have the right to say things about you, and you're not the one who decides what we keep. So it's very, it's going to be much more controversial to have a right to be forgotten in the United States, but it's very popular in Europe.
I think that you should go to Congress and get that rolling. What do you think? Show of hands. Yes, I will say I do want to share a little bit of a personal perspective. So I've been a TV news journalist for many years. Some of you probably weren't born yet, but I remember the days before internet, and I grew up on it. And as a journalist, we were very specifically trained, get the facts, make sure what you put out there is, 100% correct. And then it also in terms of our reputation too. So from a very early age, I was very careful with make sure I don't have an opinion, make sure I don't do this, don't do anything, don't do shots in a bar, don't post it, whatever, don't post bikini shots. I was very strict with myself about what I posted, just because I knew my job was on the line. If I posted anything inappropriate, anything came back weird, I could lose my job and my reputation and my livelihood, even everything from DUIs, you just have to be really careful. So I feel like I've been fortunate in that, schooled in that. Unfortunately, thankfully, because of my journalism background, a lot of people haven't, and they've had to sort of learn the hard way. And so I have 2 kids, and I instruct them. I'm very strict about okay, you just have to assume everything you post is forever, which honestly is kind of a sad way to live in a way, because now everybody in the general public has to be as careful as I am, and it's not always fun. Let's be honest about it. Also grateful for the days pre-internet. We were laughing about it, there's no everything that we did as youngsters, there's no evidence of that. So anyway, but
Stephanie, I'm wondering, how do you feel as a professional journalist that you're competing against many people who also have a microphone who are not professional journalists? Does that seem unfair to you?
Well, it's interesting. In the earlier days, it was a little annoying, I'll be honest, because people would come in and you'd see them getting in these premier positions or whatever the case. And it was hey, wait a minute, I worked for X amount of years in small markets and did this and took the path. And then you have these people coming in who are just because they have a following or they're influencers or whatever. So that was a little frustrating. But I will say at the end of the day, there is still my background, my credibility still carries a cachet, which again goes back to me having to be extra careful because I have a cachet. People know that when they come to me, I hope that what I say is true to the best of my ability. I am uncovering the truth. I have the experience, the credibility to back it up. So for me, maybe in the earlier days it was a little frustrating, and but now, like, I know who I am, I know what I bring to the table, and I hope that people are now seeing the credibility that lies behind, my background and what I bring, if that makes any sense at all.
Would you advise people to go to journalism school today, given the fact that many journalistic organizations are, under a lot of stress?
It's funny. A lot of people, when you say, "Oh, you're a journalist," a lot of my colleagues jokingly say, like, "Oh, geez, change your major and run." Yeah, it's been hard, and it's been really hard these last 4 years. People regularly yell out fake news. It's kind of not been great, I'll be honest. But we're moving forward. I'm looking forward to the future, and I hope that I can only just hope that what I bring is true, fair, honest to the best of my ability. I wouldn't discourage anyone from becoming a journalist. Um, I love it. It's not. I always tell people, for me, it's not what I do; it's who I am. And so it's just so ingrained in me that and I love it, and I'm super passionate about it. And if that's something that people want to pursue, I would highly encourage it. But it's not easy, and it has not been easy. It's been tough. I mean, we've taken a lot of heat, a lot of flack, a lot of meanness, and just everything from online to in person. But yeah, it's been interesting to say the least. Someone, Matthew, is asking a question: how do you feel about Tim Berners-Lee views on censorship and his project to build a new internet? Are you familiar with that?
I am familiar with it. I mean, I think it's. I think he is a great pioneer and thought leader. I'm not sure if it's realistic that we are going to make a transition away from the platforms that are dominant right now. It would be nice. It would be nice if we had a freer speech environment, and yet as we've been discussing in this chat, there's been so much abuse and manipulation that the companies that might have started out being very idealistic about speech are now saying we have to have controls and we have to have limits and we have to have bans on people. I don't think things are going to change rapidly. Although I would love to see alternative visions and alternative environments be realized, because these are really good ideas.
Yeah. How can I want to ask you about this? So how are these internet companies able to read minds? Because I swear to you, you got to tell me this secret of this. I mean, I'll be literally even not just talking about something, thinking something, and it will come. Has this happened to any of you guys? Come on, I'm serious now. It's been. It is.
You're talking about. Yeah, it does happen.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Give us the secret. I know you know. I know you're in on this.
Well, let me. I don't know how to break this down. We are surrounded by applications, smartphones, devices that are either listening, in the case of a phone, or tracking us. And the tech companies are super smart, right? They've gotten very good at cross-referencing everything. So if I'm shopping on Amazon or on let's use a third-party site, if I'm shopping for a sweater, all of a sudden I see ads for sweaters everywhere, right? In my iPhone, in other places. And that's because my profile has been very accurately tracked and parsed, and they know what I'm watching, when I'm watching it. And eventually I'll be served TV commercials about sweaters until I buy one or I don't buy one. So the environment can be scary. I do want to diffuse a myth, if I might. Amazon and Google have products, the Echo Dot in the case of Amazon, which is called Alexa by all of us. It's not listening to you all the time and recording your conversations. It is not doing that. It is listening for a keyword, which is usually Alexa, in order to be activated. So it's accurate to say it is listening all the time to be initiated and start, but it is not recording all of the ambient conversations in the home. I get that question quite a bit.
Okay, good. Well, I don't know about that, but thank you. What did you guys think after having this chat here right now? I mean, has it made you guys think about the way you conduct your social media, privacy, the things you say, the things you do? I mean, what's going through your minds? Jennifer, she's smiling over there. Go ahead. Let's get to
I lived in China, so it's a
Wow.
whole different thing for me. I was in Indonesia for Obama's election in 2012. I was living in Japan when Trump was elected.
Oh, you were.
And I was living in China when he started his re-election campaign and started talking down about China, where China started immediate reparations against all the Americans living there. So it's a bit different for me. I only allow the microphone on for apps that I currently use. I don't have any Chinese owned apps on my phone. I don't use TikTok. I don't use WeChat. As soon as I got out, I deleted them all. When I was living there, I had actually planned on coming back to the States and not going to China. And so I had a second phone. And so I used my old phone with my Chinese SIM card. And then I had my new phone with my American SIM card in it, purposely to keep them separated, because China's at a point where if you're plugging your phone in to a wall, they can read data just through the metal prongs in the wall. They don't even need a USB connection. And so it's a whole different playing field for me. But that's it was a funny question. I found some of that relaxing now that I'm back, ironically enough. But some of that still holds true. It depends on the app. Like, I trust WhatsApp because it's end-to-end encrypted.
Oh, interesting.
Some of the others, like Line, which is Japanese, or Kakao Talk, which is Korean, those ones I have camera and microphone shut off unless I'm using them, because my friends and students don't message me as often there as they do on WhatsApp or just through Instagram. So it completely depends on the application for me, but I trust WhatsApp more than anything else.
That's cool. So you're definitely heightened. You're in a different headspace. It's all good to really think about. I mean,
Yeah.
It's really good. Anyone else modifying, or are you guys changing your phones right now as we speak? Changing your settings?
There is a question in the chat that I saw.
Oh, yes. Let's take a look from Amanda. Would Facebook ever consider altering algorithms to provide a small percentage of opposing views to a user's likes to offset bombarding them with the same information?
That's a great question. Facebook can do that. I think they are considering right now how they're using their algorithm to serve people with information. But it goes way beyond simply the content of what you might like or have watched in the past. Facebook has so many inputs into your behavior. If you are on a friend's page and you're not doing anything, you're not saying like, you're not clicking, Facebook actually monitors how long you stay on that page just silently watching. That's an input. Also, the time of day that you visit. Also, for some reason, the battery level on your iPhone. I mean, these are things that Facebook is using that creates over 50,000 inputs that go into that algorithm. Beyond the technical ability of the average user to understand. But could they develop a simplified interface that says, I want more neutral views, and I want 10% of views that are not my professed views? Yes, they could do that. And I think that we will see some experimentation there. What I don't think we will see is sort of the total privacy Facebook. That's not going to happen. We're going to have this platform and also Twitter for quite a while going forward.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting in sharing a little bit more about my situation too, because I work in media. Um, I have a very public page, and because when Facebook first started, I didn't have a professional page. And so I just did everything on my one page. And then I built up those followers to over 5,000. I maxed that out. But then I started doing everything on there. And I kind of got in this bad trap where I had friends on there, but then I had strangers on there, and it was all weird. And then I use it sort of professionally and personally, which I don't like that. It's not a great thing. But then I kind of resolved myself to the fact that, like, everything is so out there now that, like, if someone wants to find out where you live and someone wants to find you, they can find you. So I've sort of given over to that, which is probably a terrible thing. Um, Alex, how do you feel about that?
It is hard to the lines blur between your work environment, your work friends. I think many people try to keep LinkedIn as their business social network and Facebook as their personal. But I think you kind of crossed the line. I don't think there's going back. It was so much. You put a lot of information out there to thousands of people. You are losing your privacy. I think what's very sad is that if your account gets hacked, um, you know, uh, malicious actors can take over your account and find out all this information about you. So, we really do need to be concerned about the security of our accounts, and not having sensitive information out there about even what our local neighborhood is, because someone could figure out what bank you go to, or what school your kids go to. So these are very sensitive data points that can be exposed and are exposed, unfortunately. The thing is that the world we're living in now runs on data. It's been said that data is the currency of this age, the digital age. And I know that some of the students in the audience are taking programs in data and data science. And actually, it's a terrific skill to be building right now, because having a better understanding of how data is collected and how data is used and how data is interpreted, it's not only great for someone's career, but it's going to give you a lot of insights into the world that we live in, which is, as we've been talking about, just very data driven.
It sounds like, the big takeaway for me is that privacy is really our personal responsibility. I mean, at the end of the day, it sounds like it's really up to us, which makes sense. What about the FCC, though, going forward, the government? I mean, are we going to see anything? Are they going to step in? Should they? Can they?
Well, we're in a position right now where Amazon, Google, Facebook have been sued by the federal government for antitrust violations, which means that the government feels like they have engaged at some level in anti-competitive business practices. And there are examples of all of these companies doing things to compete against smaller companies, to withhold information, to manipulate information. So these are real problems, and we're going to see these lawsuits play out. What we are not going to see, I would predict, is we're not going to see Google being broken up into 5 companies. Actually, how would you do that, right? Would you have some search that's A to F and then G to M, right? You can't break up the search functionality of Google. You might prevent Google from getting into other businesses. So I think that on the antitrust side, there's going to be a very long, drawn-out, bloody conflict between the big tech companies and the federal government. The FCC is fighting another fight on an issue called net neutrality, which is, can we keep the internet free and fair in terms of all the different kinds of content that is published, so that an internet service provider such as a Comcast or Time Warner can't favor one type of content over another type of content, or an internet service provider can't block a website because they don't like the content on that website. So this is what's involved in what we've been calling net neutrality. The Obama administration was fairly in favor of net neutrality and adopted it. The Trump administration was not in favor of net neutrality and abolished some of the rules that had been adopted by the FCC. So now we're back to square one. It's like, where are we going to go on net neutrality? Which is, I think, for many people, a very important, principle.
June has a question. She says, should the fairness doctrine be reinstated? Should it extend to the internet and not just TV and radio?
There used to be a thing called the fairness doctrine where a television or radio station had to give equal time to opposing viewpoints. And when the FCC got rid of the fairness doctrine, some people say that's when we got into these cable news stations, both on the left and on the right side of the political spectrum, that allowed one point of view and they didn't have to balance it. So even though, just to pick on Fox News, the national network, say they're fair and balanced, there's nothing requiring them to be fair and balanced. There's no fairness doctrine. I don't think, though, we can bring it back. First, because it's very hard to determine what is the opposing point of view, how many different opposing views are there, and also how can you apply that to the internet, which has every flavor of speech on it, millions of different varieties of speech, and enforce it. So I think we're in a period of chaos for a long time. And that what we really do need is for people to be more internet savvy and media literate. And, some of you in the audience have actually said they go and look at different sites for news. They look at different sources. They go to different places. I think this is really a good concept to be a smart consumer of the news that you get and not just get it from one source.
Exactly. And I work for Fox 11, which is a local Fox. So we don't, support or anything with the national. So we just try to keep it local. But I also work for NBC too. I'm a freelancer. So I'm in a very unique position where I freelance for Fox 11 on the local level. And then I also work for NBC Network on the national level. And the two worlds don't really collide. So I feel like I have a good blend of, experience and a good wide breadth of experience. That was a great question, June, by the way. Thank you for bringing that up. So basically you're just saying, okay, it is what it is. We're in trouble here, Alex. I don't know. That didn't sound very encouraging.
We have to live with chaos. And, people, it has not, this is not a new thing, right? I mean, if you go back to in American history, and you can go back to the election of 1800 between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, and people were saying the same things about political speech is out of bounds, and you can't trust anybody, and there's no fairness, and there's only one point of view. So these themes have actually been with us. I think what makes it more dramatic is that as I said at the outset, the communications platform has changed, and these communication platforms are dominating our headspace.
100%. Laura has a question. What is your take on private companies that are not news sources, however, have large followings, releasing statements? And she used Nike as an example, releasing statements and opinions that are socially or politically sensitive. Do you think that they should speak up, or are we asking too much of them? We're seeing a lot of this with companies jumping in, and then, they're getting canceled or whatever, depending on the side of the aisle they are.
This is a pretty new phenomenon. When I grew up in the internet business, we were asked or told to be neutral, like don't take an opinion, don't express a point of view. So if I had been told working for ESPN in the 1990s to take a pro Black Lives Matter opinion, that would have been against our corporate governance. We would not have done that. And now you see companies much more willing to identify for or against particular causes. They're private actors, they're private companies. They believe, some of them believe this is part of their social responsibility. Others might, if you were cynical, you might say they want to, attract a certain audience. There are risks for corporations to engage in this behavior because issues do change and public perception does change. But it's super interesting to see what has happened in the last year.
Yeah. All right. Well, I guess we're going to be wrapping up here soon. So, why don't we get a closing statement from you before we do? Anyone have any last questions that you guys want to throw over to Alex before we start to wrap up?
Career advice?
Oh, yes. All right. So yeah, Alex, in closing, what do you want to say about privacy going forward? I mean, you basically said we're in chaos, so I don't know. I'd like to hope that the chaos will be calming, but
Well, I think that it's important for us to be educated, citizens. A lot of people adhere to that, but I think the real test is, first we have to live out, our persona in terms of our values, and that's not that easy to do all the time. It's not easy to say this is what I believe in, and I'm willing to take the heat if someone disagrees with me. I think especially as someone in the educational system, we're in an environment now where it's becoming increasingly hard sometimes for people to express themselves. We need to maintain a free and fair and open environment, which means we have to be willing to listen and not prejudge people. I think that's super important, not just only in academia, but in our social lives. This polarization that we see on social media has been damaging to our country. Now we can blame the platform, right? We can blame the technology, and there certainly is some blame to go around. But as you said earlier, Stephanie, we also have some personal responsibility as to what we put out there about ourselves and who we are. So that's my note of I don't know, caution maybe. But it's important, and these technologies are so powerful that we don't really understand them completely.
yeah, absolutely. Well, Alex, thank you. This has been so great, so eye-opening, such good information. So we want to thank you for, having this fireside chat with us.